The crack of a Winchester rifle echoed through the Montana wilderness as Vaughn Caldwell slid from his horse, boots landing with a heavy thud on the dusty ground. The year was 1879, and the railroad company had sent him with clear instructions: tear down the cabin standing in the way of progress and convince its stubborn owner to accept their buyout. As the tall, broad-shouldered cowboy adjusted his worn leather hat, he had no idea that the woman behind that cabin door would change everything. Vaughn approached cautiously, taking in the modest homestead with practiced eyes. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a vegetable garden to one side and chickens pecking in a fenced yard. For a railroad company eager to lay tracks through this valley, it was nothing but an inconvenience. For someone, it was clearly home. "Hello, the house," he called, keeping a respectful distance. His hand hovered near his holster, not out of aggression, but habit born from years on the frontier. "I'm here on behalf of Western Union Railroad." The door creaked open slowly, and Vaughn's rehearsed speech died in his throat. Standing in the doorway, with a shotgun gripped firmly in her hands, was a woman with copper-colored hair and fierce green eyes. Her dress was simple and practical, but what caught Vaughn's attention immediately was the pronounced swell of her belly beneath the fabric. 7 months along, if he had to guess. "Mrs. Mitchell?" he asked, recalling the name from his papers. "Miss," she corrected, not lowering her weapon. "Margaret Mitchell. And you can tell your railroad I'm not selling." Vaughn removed his hat, feeling suddenly awkward. "Madam, I'm afraid it's not that simple. I've been sent to bully a woman off her land," she finished for him. "You wouldn't be the first, Mr. Caldwell." "Vaughn Caldwell." He cleared his throat. "And I'm not here to bully anyone, Miss Mitchell. I'm just the messenger." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Messengers don't usually come armed with demolition tools." She nodded toward his saddlebags, where the edge of a crowbar was visible. Vaughn had been in tight spots before gunfights in Dodge City, cattle rustlers in Texas, but something about this pregnant woman's unwavering gaze made him more uncomfortable than any outlaw ever had. "The company's made its decision, madam. This valley's the only viable route for the new line. They've offered fair compensation." "Fair?" Margaret's laugh was sharp and bitter. "They offered me half what this place is worth, knowing full well I've nowhere else to go." She gestured toward her belly. "Especially now." Vaughn shifted his weight, dust swirling around his worn boots. The railroad hadn't mentioned her condition. Of course they hadn't. It would have complicated things, and the men who ran Western Union didn't like complications. "Look, Miss Mitchell, it's getting dark, Mr. Caldwell," she interrupted, glancing at the setting sun. "Whatever you plan to do, you won't be doing it tonight. There's a creek half a mile east if you need to make camp." With that, she closed the door firmly, leaving Vaughn standing in the growing shadows with his hat in his hands and an unexpected weight in his chest. That night, as he sat by his small fire, Vaughn pulled out the railroad contract and stared at it. The terms were indeed harsh, the compensation barely enough for Margaret to start over somewhere else. He'd done this kind of work before, convincing reluctant homesteaders to move on, but never someone in her condition, never someone so alone. Sleep came fitfully, his dreams filled with green eyes and accusations. Dawn broke with a chorus of birdsong. Vaughn had made his decision during the long night. He would talk to her, really talk to her, understand her situation before making any moves. The railroad could wait another day. As he approached the cabin again, he noticed Margaret in the garden, struggling to pull a stubborn weed while keeping her balance. Without thinking, he quickened his pace. "Let me help you with that, madam," he offered, reaching for the weed. Margaret straightened, one hand instinctively moving to her lower back. "I don't need your help, Mr. Caldwell. What I need is for you and your railroad to leave me be. I understand that." But he gestured toward a bucket of water near the garden. "At least let me carry that for you." She hesitated, then nodded curtly. As he lifted the bucket, he noticed her small hands were red and calloused from work. "Where's your husband, Miss Mitchell? If you don't mind me asking." Margaret's expression hardened. "Dead. Fever took him last winter, before he even knew about the baby." She turned toward the cabin. "If you're going to help, you might as well come in for coffee. Though I don't see how it changes anything." Inside, the cabin was modest but meticulously kept. A small table with 2 chairs occupied one corner, a cast iron stove another. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the space with a pleasant aroma. "How long have you been here?" Vaughn asked, removing his hat and taking the seat she offered. 3 years. Margaret moved efficiently around the small space, preparing coffee. "Thomas and I came out from Pennsylvania. He had dreams of ranching, but we started small. The land was cheap because nobody wanted it." She smiled faintly. "Now, suddenly, everyone does. The railroad's not giving you much choice," Vaughn admitted, accepting the steaming cup she handed him. "No, they're not." She lowered herself carefully into the chair opposite him. "But neither am I. This is my home, Mr. Caldwell. This is where my husband is buried. This is where my child will be born." Vaughn looked down at his coffee, the reality of her situation sinking in. "When's the baby due?" "August," she replied. "Just over 2 months from now." "And you're out here alone? No family, no neighbors?" "The nearest neighbor is the Wilsons, about 5 miles west. They check on me when they can, but they've got their own hardships." She studied him over the rim of her cup. "Why are you asking all these questions? Does it make it easier to sleep at night, knowing the story of the people you displace?" Her words stung because there was truth in them. Vaughn had never thought much about the people affected by the railroad's expansion. They were just names on paper, obstacles to progress. "No, madam," he answered honestly. "But it might make it harder, and maybe that's not such a bad thing." Something in his tone must have reached her because Margaret's expression softened slightly. "What will you tell your employers?" Vaughn set his cup down. "I don't know yet." It was the truth. He'd come here with clear instructions and a deadline, but the sight of this brave woman fighting for her home had shaken his certainty. "Well, while you're figuring it out," Margaret said, rising with effort, "I've got chores that won't do themselves." "Let me help," Vaughn offered again, standing quickly. "I'm here anyway," and he gestured vaguely toward her belly. Margaret looked like she wanted to refuse, pride shining in her eyes, but practicality won out. "The roof leaks when it rains. Thomas never got around to fixing it." And so Vaughn found himself spending the day not tearing down Margaret Mitchell's cabin, but repairing it instead. He patched the roof, fixed a broken window shutter, and reinforced the chicken coop against predators. All the while, Margaret worked alongside him as much as she was able, directing his efforts and occasionally allowing herself a small smile at his progress. By sunset, Vaughn was sweaty and tired, but satisfied with the day's work. As they sat on the small porch, watching the light fade from the sky, he found himself telling her about his life growing up in Missouri, fighting briefly in the war despite being too young, and drifting west afterward. "How did you end up working for the railroad?" she asked, her voice softer than it had been that morning. "Fell into it, I suppose. Started as security for the construction crews. Good with a gun, good with my fists when needed." He looked down at his calloused hands. "When they saw I could talk sense into people, they started sending me ahead to clear the way." "You mean to intimidate people off their land?" Vaughn didn't deny it. "It's never come to force, if that's what you're thinking. Most folks take the money when they see there's no alternative. And if I don't?" The question hung in the air between them. Vaughn met her gaze. "I don't know, Miss Mitchell, but I'm not tearing down your home while you're still in it. That much I do know." The next morning, Vaughn rode into the nearest town, Silver Creek, a small settlement that had sprung up to serve the surrounding ranches. He needed supplies, and, more importantly, he needed to send a telegraph to his employers. The telegraph office was a small addition to the general store, manned by a bald man with spectacles who eyed Vaughn suspiciously as he wrote out his message. "Need more time, stop situation complicated, stop resident expecting child, stop advice, stop." He paid for the telegram and wandered across the street to the mercantile, purchasing coffee, sugar, and other staples that he'd noticed were running low in Margaret's pantry. He added a bolt of soft flannel fabric on impulse, thinking she might need it for the baby. As he loaded his purchases onto his horse, a voice called out from the saloon. "Caldwell, that you?" Vaughn turned to see Patrick Donovan, another railroad man he'd worked with in the past, stumbling out of the swinging doors. "Donovan," Vaughn acknowledged with a nod. "What brings you to Silver Creek?" "Same as you, I reckon." Donovan's eyes narrowed at the supplies on Vaughn's horse. "Word is you're having trouble with the Mitchell property." "No trouble," Vaughn replied carefully. "Just taking my time to do the job right." Donovan spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Bosses are getting impatient. They sent me to check on your progress." He gestured toward the packages. "Don't look like you're making any. Like I said, doing the job right. Vaughn mounted his horse, looking down at Donovan. Tell them I'll send word when it's done. Sure you will. Donovan's smile didn't reach his eyes. Just remember which side your bread's buttered on, Caldwell. The warning was clear, and it followed Vaughn all the way back to Margaret's cabin. The railroad wouldn't wait forever, and now they were watching him. When he arrived, he found Margaret sitting on the porch, her face pale and drawn. She struggled to stand as he approached. You're back, she said, sounding genuinely surprised. I thought perhaps you'd decided to return to your employers. Not yet. Vaughn dismounted, concern furrowing his brow. Are you all right, Miss Mitchell? Just tired. She gestured toward the garden, where fresh turned earth showed she'd been working. I might have overdone it a bit. Vaughn frowned, taking in her exhausted appearance. You shouldn't be working so hard in your condition. The garden won't tend itself, Mr. Caldwell. Despite her words, she accepted his arm as he helped her back into the cabin. Vaughn, he corrected, setting her gently in a chair. If I'm going to be fixing your roof and fetching your water, you might as well use my given name. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Vaughn then, and I suppose you should call me Margaret. He busied himself putting away the supplies he'd brought, noticing how her eyes widened slightly at the quantity. You didn't have to, she began. I wanted to, he interrupted. Consider it payment for the coffee and conversation. When he presented the flannel, her fingers traced the soft material with wonder. This is too much. Every baby needs blankets, Vaughn said, feeling suddenly awkward under her gaze. At least, that's what my ma always said. A single tear slid down Margaret's cheek, which she quickly brushed away. Thank you. It's been difficult preparing for this child alone. Vaughn felt a tightness in his chest at her vulnerability. You're not alone now, he said quietly, then quickly added, at least for the time being. That night, after Margaret had gone to bed, Vaughn sat on the porch contemplating his situation. The railroad expected him to evacuate her and tear down the cabin. But how could he displace a pregnant widow with nowhere to go? Yet if he didn't do his job, someone like Donovan would simply take his place, someone who wouldn't hesitate to force Margaret out. His troubled thoughts were interrupted by a cry from inside the cabin. He was through the door in an instant, hand on his gun. Margaret was sitting up in bed, her face contorted in pain, both hands pressed to her belly. What is it? What's wrong? Vaughn asked, panic rising in his throat. The baby, she gasped. Something's not right. It's too early. Vaughn's mind raced. I'll fetch the doctor from town. Margaret shook her head, clutching his arm. No time. It could be hours before you return. The Wilsons' Martha Wilson has midwifed before. 5 miles west, you said? At her nod, Vaughn squeezed her hand. I'll be back as quick as I can. Hold on. He raced to his horse, spurring it into a gallop as soon as he cleared the yard. The night was dark, the trail barely visible, but Vaughn pushed on, guided by the stars and desperation. The Wilson farm appeared as a distant lantern light after what seemed like an eternity. Vaughn's shouts brought a wary farmer to the door, shotgun in hand. Martha Wilson? Vaughn called out, still mounted. It's Margaret Mitchell, her baby's coming early. The mention of Margaret's name changed everything. Within minutes, Martha Wilson, a sturdy woman with kind eyes, was gathering supplies and instructing her husband to hitch the wagon. Who are you? She asked Vaughn as they worked. A friend. He replied simply, helping her husband with the horses. The return journey seemed even longer, despite the fact that Martha insisted on riding with Vaughn while her husband followed with the wagon. When they finally reached the cabin, Margaret's cries could be heard from outside. Martha took charge immediately, sending both men outside. Boil water and then stay out of the way, she ordered. The next few hours were the longest of Vaughn's life. He paced the yard, jumped at every sound from within the cabin, and prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. When the distinctive cry of a newborn finally pierced the night, he nearly collapsed with relief. Martha emerged some time later, wiping her hands on her apron. A girl, she announced. Small, but fighting. Like her mother. She studied Vaughn curiously. Margaret says you're with the railroad. Vaughn nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Funny kind of railroad man who repairs roofs and fetches midwives, she observed dryly. You can go in now if you'd like. Just for a moment. Inside, the cabin was warm and smelled of blood and sweat, but also something new, something like hope. Margaret lay in bed, her copper hair dark with perspiration, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in the flannel Vaughn had brought. "You came back," she whispered as he approached. "Of course I did." Vaughn stood awkwardly by the bedside, overwhelmed by the intimacy of the moment. Margaret turned the bundle slightly, revealing a tiny red face crowned with wisps of dark hair. "Meet Victoria," she said softly. "Victoria Thomas Mitchell." Vaughn stared at the infant, marveling at how someone so small could suddenly make the world seem so different. "She's beautiful," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "She came early, but Martha says she's strong." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I was so afraid." Without thinking, Vaughn took her hand. "You're both going to be fine," he promised. "I'll make sure of it." The conviction in his voice surprised even him, but he meant every word. In that moment, he knew he couldn't carry out the railroad's orders. He couldn't destroy this home, this sanctuary for Margaret and her daughter. Over the next few days, Vaughn barely left the cabin. He chopped wood, tended the garden, and helped Martha Wilson, who stayed to care for mother and child. He even held little Victoria when Margaret needed rest, marveling at how perfectly the infant fit in his large, weathered hands. A week after Victoria's birth, a rider approached the cabin. Vaughn recognized Donovan's slouching form immediately and met him in the yard, well away from the house. "So this is why you've been stalling," Donovan sneered, taking in the domestic scene. "Got yourself a cozy little setup, haven't you, Caldwell?" "What do you want, Donovan?" "Railroad's tired of waiting." Donovan handed over a telegram. "You're off the job. I'm taking over." Vaughn read the message, his jaw tightening. "They can't do this. She just had a baby. Not the railroad's problem." Donovan's hand moved to his gun. "You've got till tomorrow to clear out. Then I start knocking down walls, whether she's inside or not. You touch this place, and I'll kill you," Vaughn said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Donovan's eyes narrowed. "You'd turn against your own for some woman you barely know?" "I know her well enough." Vaughn stepped closer. "Ride back to town, Donovan. Tell them you couldn't find me. Tell them whatever you want, but Margaret Mitchell stays here." For a tense moment, Vaughn thought Donovan might draw on him. Then the man spat and turned his horse. "You're making a big mistake, Caldwell. The railroad don't take kindly to traitors." As Donovan rode away, Vaughn knew he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The railroad would send others, perhaps many others. One man, even one as determined as he was, couldn't stand against them forever. Inside, he found Margaret sitting up in bed, Victoria nursing at her breast. She must have seen something in his expression because her face paled. "What is it?" she asked. Vaughn sat heavily in the chair beside her bed. "The railroad's getting impatient. They've sent someone else to finish the job." Margaret clutched Victoria closer. "When? Tomorrow, he says." Vaughn ran a hand through his hair. "I sent him away, but they'll send others." "What are we going to do?" The fear in her voice tore at him. Vaughn reached out, gently touching Victoria's downy head. "I have an idea," he said slowly, "but you might not like it." The next morning found them preparing to leave. Martha Wilson had returned with her husband's wagon, helping Margaret pack what few possessions she couldn't bear to leave behind. Victoria, wrapped snugly in her flannel blanket, slept peacefully, unaware of the turmoil around her. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret asked Vaughn for the third time as he loaded her trunk onto the wagon. "It's the only way," he replied. "The railroad won't stop. If not Donovan, they'll send someone else, someone worse." His plan was risky, but simple. His brother Victor owned a small ranch near Cheyenne, Wyoming territory. It wasn't much, but it was far from the railroad's influence, and Victor had always said Vaughn was welcome there. They would start fresh, away from Western Union's reach. What he hadn't told Margaret was that he'd liquidated his savings account in Silver Creek that morning, using most of the money to purchase the deed to her land from the local land office. It had cost him nearly everything he had, but now he held legal ownership of the property ownership he intended to transfer to Margaret once they were safely away. As Martha helped Margaret into the wagon, Vaughn took one last look at the cabin. It seemed wrong to abandon it after all Margaret had done to keep it, but a home was more than just walls and a roof. It was people, family. With Victoria's birth, Vaughn had realized something profound. He wanted to be part of that family. The feelings that had grown in him for Margaret over these past weeks were unlike anything he'd experienced before. He couldn't name it love, yet it was too new, too fragile, but it was heading rapidly in that direction. They had just finished loading the last of their supplies when the sound of approaching horses made them all freeze. Vaughn's hand went to his gun as 6 riders appeared on the horizon. "Get in the wagon," he told Margaret quietly. "If anything happens, Martha will take you to Cheyenne." "Vaughn, don't, please," he cut her off. "Trust me." As the riders approached, Vaughn recognized Donovan at their head, alongside James Mercer, the railroad's regional manager. The other 4 men were clearly hired guns, their expressions hard beneath the brims of their hats. "Caldwell," Mercer called as they reined in. "What's the meaning of this?" "Donovan says you've gone rogue on us." Vaughn stood his ground, one hand still near his holster. "No, sir, just doing things properly." He pulled out the deed from his pocket. "This land belongs to me now. I purchased it fair and square this morning." Mercer's face reddened. "You had no authority. I didn't need authority. I had cash." Vaughn's voice was steady. "The railroad can negotiate with me now if they want this land. And my price just went up considerably." Donovan leaned forward in his saddle. "You double-crossing." "Enough," Mercer interrupted. He studied Vaughn with calculating eyes. "What's your game, Caldwell? What do you want?" "Time," Vaughn replied honestly. "Time for Miss Mitchell to recover from childbirth and find somewhere new to settle. Time for her to get a fair price for her labor." "The woman means that much to you?" Mercer asked, his tone suggesting he'd found a weakness to exploit. Vaughn glanced back at Margaret, who watched from the wagon, Victoria cradled protectively in her arms. "Yes," he said simply. "She does." Something in his tone must have convinced Mercer of his sincerity, because the man sighed heavily. "Very well, Caldwell. You've bought yourself some time. But the railroad will have this land eventually. The route is already surveyed and approved." "Maybe so," Vaughn conceded. "But you'll pay a fair price for it, and you'll deal with me, not with a woman who's just brought a child into the world." After the railroad men departed, with Donovan casting dark looks over his shoulder, Margaret climbed carefully down from the wagon. "Did you really buy my land?" she asked, her voice a mixture of confusion and wonder. Vaughn nodded, suddenly unsure of himself. "I couldn't think of another way to stop them. I should have asked you first, but there wasn't time." "Why would you do that?" "Spend your savings on land the railroad will eventually take anyway." He looked down at Victoria, sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. "Because some things are worth fighting for, even if you can't win. Some people are worth protecting, whatever the cost." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Vaughn Caldwell, you are nothing like the man who rode up to my door 2 weeks ago." "No," he agreed. "I'm not. That man thought he knew what mattered in life. He was wrong." In the silence that followed, Martha Wilson cleared her throat pointedly. "Well, I think you two have some talking to do. John and I will head back to our place. You know where to find us if you need anything." As the Wilsons departed, Vaughn and Margaret stood awkwardly in the yard, the future suddenly wide open before them. "We don't have to leave right away," Vaughn said finally. "I bought us some time. The railroad won't be back for a while." Margaret shifted Victoria in her arms, studying Vaughn's face. "And then what?" "When they do come back, then we'll have a decision to make." He gestured toward the cabin. "This is your home, Margaret. I won't take that from you. If you want to stay and fight, I'll fight alongside you. If you want to start fresh somewhere else, I'll help you do that too." "And where do you fit into this future?" she asked softly. "Once the railroad is dealt with, one way or another?" Vaughn took a deep breath. "Wherever you'll have me," he answered honestly. "These past weeks, getting to know you, seeing your strength, helping with Victoria." He trailed off, searching for the right words. "I didn't expect any of this when I rode up that first day, but I can't imagine riding away now." Margaret's eyes widened, a blush coloring her cheeks. "Vaughn, are you saying—" "I'm saying I care for you, Margaret. More than I thought possible in such a short time." He took a tentative step toward her. "I'm not asking for promises. It's too soon, and you've been through too much. But I'd like the chance to see where this leads, if you would." For a long moment, Margaret simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, shifting Victoria to one arm, she reached out and took his hand. "I'd like that too," she whispered. "Very much." The months that followed were among the happiest of Vaughn's life. He moved into the small shed behind Margaret's cabin, insisting on maintaining propriety despite her protests that it was unnecessary. Together, They weathered Victoria's colic, her first smile, her growing awareness of the world around her. Vaughn built an addition to the cabin, expanding it in preparation for the harsh Montana winter. He repaired fences, dug a new well closer to the house, and even planted apple trees that would someday grow tall and strong. The railroad didn't return that summer, nor in the fall. Vaughn suspected Mercer was waiting for a more opportune moment, or perhaps seeking an alternate route. Either way, he remained vigilant, never quite trusting that they were truly free of the threat. As winter settled over the valley, blanketing the cabin in snow and ice, Vaughn and Margaret grew closer. Their evening conversations by the fire stretched longer, their stolen glances more meaningful. Victoria thrived under their combined care, growing from a fragile newborn into a robust, curious infant with her mother's green eyes and determination. On Christmas Eve, with Victoria sleeping soundly in her cradle and a fire crackling in the hearth, Vaughn finally found the courage to speak what had been in his heart for months. "I love you, Margaret," he said simply, taking her hands in his. "I think I have since that first week, when you stood your ground against me with nothing but courage and a shotgun." Margaret's laugh was warm and joyful. "I was terrified that day. You looked so fierce, so determined. And now I see the man beneath that fierce exterior." She squeezed his hands. "The man who risked everything for a woman and child he barely knew. The man who rocks my daughter to sleep when she's fussy and thinks I don't notice him singing to her." Vaughn felt his cheeks warm. "You heard that." "I hear everything," she teased, then grew serious. "I love you too, Vaughn. I didn't think it was possible to love again after Thomas, but what I feel for you. It's different, but just as real, just as deep." He kissed her then, gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded in kind. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he whispered. "Let me be a father to Victoria. Let me build a life with you, whether it's here or somewhere new." Margaret's answer was another kiss, this one filled with promise and certainty. They were married on New Year's Day, 1880, in the Silver Creek Church, with the Wilsons standing as witnesses and Victoria, dressed in a gown made from the flannel Vaughn had brought months before, watching with solemn eyes from Martha's arms. The telegram arrived 3 days later, delivered by a nervous young man from the Silver Creek office. It was from James Mercer of the railroad. Alternate route secured. Stop. No further interest in Mitchell property. Stop. Deed restrictions. Enclosed. Stop. Enclosed was a legal document stating that while the railroad relinquished any claim to the property, no structures could be built within 50 feet of the original cabin. It was a strange condition, but one that Vaughn and Margaret were happy to accept. "Why do you think they changed their minds?" Margaret asked as they celebrated their unexpected victory. Vaughn shrugged, bouncing Victoria on his knee. "Maybe they found a better route. Maybe Mercer has more conscience than I gave him credit for. Either way, this land is ours now, free and clear." "Ours," Margaret repeated, savoring the word. "A place for Victoria to grow up, to run and play. And for her brothers and sisters," Vaughn added with a grin, pulling his wife closer. Margaret's eyebrows rose. "Brothers and sisters? You seem very sure about that, Mr. Caldwell." "Just hopeful, Mrs. Caldwell," he corrected, kissing her lightly. "Just very, very hopeful." Spring came early that year, bringing with it new growth and possibilities. Vaughn planted a larger garden, added a proper barn, and began acquiring cattle for a small herd. Margaret's skilled hands turned the expanded cabin into a true home, filled with warmth and laughter. Victoria took her first steps in April, toddling determinately from Margaret's arms to Vaughn's waiting hands. Her first words soon followed, "Papa," a declaration that brought tears to Vaughn's eyes and joy to his heart. In June, as wildflowers carpeted the valley and the apple trees showed their first tiny fruit, Margaret shared news that completed their happiness. Another child would join their family by winter's end. Standing on the porch one evening, Victoria sleeping against his shoulder and Margaret's hand in his, Vaughn reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had come to tear down a home and had instead found one. He had come as a harbinger of progress and had instead discovered what truly mattered. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret asked, leaning against him. "How differently things might have turned out," he replied honestly. "If I hadn't seen you that first day, standing in the doorway, protecting your home and your unborn child. If I hadn't changed my mind. But you did, she said simply. You really saw me when no one else would. You stayed when you could have left. Vaughn looked out over the land that had become so precious to him, not for its value to a railroad, but for the life it supported, the future it promised. Best decision I ever made, he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. As the sun set over the Montana wilderness, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Vaughn Caldwell held his family close, grateful beyond words for the twist of fate that had brought him to this cabin, to this woman, to this life. He had come as a destroyer and remained as a builder. He had come alone and found a family. And in the years that followed, as their family grew, as Victoria was joined by siblings, as the small homestead expanded into a thriving ranch, Vaughn never forgot that pivotal moment when he first saw Margaret Mitchell standing defiantly in her doorway, one hand on her shotgun, the other protectively cradling her unborn child. The moment that had changed everything. The moment he had been hired to tear down her cabin, then changed his mind when he saw her belly.